First I want to thank just IASIS for allowing me to do this presentation. And it's really exciting to be part of such an eclectic group of backgrounds. So I appreciate this opportunity. Today we're speaking on trauma and its impact on the synesthetic experience. So I'm currently in my MFT program, which is a marriage family therapy license, and a master's in clinical counseling. And I've been kind of just interested in how to regulate the body when it comes to traumatic experiences, or just trying to really wrap our head around what the body does in response to the brain. And as a synesthete, I thought that it'd be really impactful and helpful for the rest of the community to really just kind of take a moment and look at like how trauma is impacting this part of the human condition. So with that being said, Dr. Day and I used some subjects from the synesthesia list and took some qualitative data from them. And although this is a really important topic that we are really passionate about and want more attention for, we do want to warn you that there are some difficult topics in here, and so it is completely okay at any point if anyone feels the need to step out if it becomes too much. So let's get started. So a simple Google search shows that trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So a lot of us are probably a little bit confused by this definition, and that just kind of goes to show like the variety and scale of what trauma can be. It can be something as small as a fender bender to something as large as being in a war zone. And this definition, although it's very vague, kind of really like tells how deep that spectrum can be. And so for the sake of this presentation, we've separated trauma into two categories, emotional versus physical. However, we do realize that the two rarely occur in isolation. They're almost a part of the same exact experience. So we are aware of that. In the DSM-5, there are currently 7 stress or trauma-related disorders. However, none of them address blended sensation or altered sensory percepts. We thought that was interesting and relevant to where we're going with this. So synesthesia, trauma, and possible outcomes. There are 3 different outcomes, 3 different ways that trauma can impact the synesthetic experience. The first is that it can result in a loss of synesthesia, whether that's over a short period of time or permanently. The second is that it can change the synesthetic concurrence. So what you may have been able to experience as a synesthete before the trauma may be very different after you come out of the trauma. And then last, it can activate synesthesia in a person who didn't have it before the trauma. So a couple of schools of thought that are really important to consider when we're talking about trauma comes from some early thinkers who said that synesthesia is being caused by this physical trauma. So all of the associations are related to and can all be tied back to a traumatic experience in childhood. That is one school of thought. And another is that synesthesia is a biological predisposition, but environmental factors decide what those associations are going to be. And then the third is that synesthesia is all physiological and the associations are hardwired in. And so these are the kind of people, these are just important to think about when going forward and discussing trauma. So to go back to the first school of thought that said that synesthesia is a biological predisposition that is caused and manipulated by trauma, that specifically came from a couple of people, particularly Pfister, who was a Swiss psychoanalyst, and Vaughn, who was also a psychoanalyst. And the two of them have different papers on sessions, and one of them, Vaughn Hoog-Helmuth's paper, is more on her own experiences, but Pfister was more talking about one of his subjects, Nanette, who experienced, so one of her traumatic experiences was, so there's a lake, there's like a picture of a lake in her house, and he's gotten this information from her through a couple of sessions of psychotherapy, and eventually is able to uncover how a certain color is tied to the letter A after doing these sessions and really digging deep into like her subconscious and like finding that trauma is or a traumatic experience is what has caused her color for the letter A. So that was so this subject is named Nanette, and her letter A can be tied back to a time where her father and her were swimming at a lake, and he was wearing some sort of indecent bathing suit. It's kind of difficult to tell through the translations what was actually meant by that. Dr. Day translated it from German, but what we got from it was that the bathing suit was very revealing and what some might say inappropriate. And her father are swimming in this lake, and a woman passes by and yells something obscene at him for swimming in the lake with her like that. And before this, Nanette didn't really see her father's bathing suit. She didn't think anything of it. And just the fact that this woman embarrassed her and her father in public in such a way has kind of colored the way that she sees the letter A. So if you look at the letter A, which there's a ton up here, you see that there's a little curve with a basin in it. And through these sessions of psychotherapy, he was able to uncover that the physical shape of the letter resembled the basin of the lake. And so it's the very color of the painting in their house of this lake. And this lake that they used to swim at a lot is actually the exact color of the letter A because of the shape and the trauma experience. So the two are now inseparable. So that's one example. There's another example that comes from the Vaughn Hug-Hellemuth article that we went through. And in this article, she is discussing her experience with living. So in her home, she lived with a retired surgeon with the rest of her family. And she would sometimes go into his room to find a candy dish that was shaped blue. And we don't know if this happened on multiple occasions or just one occasion, but there was a time where he was in the room and she went to go grab a piece of candy, and he coerced her into touching his genitals. And she was 16 at the time, so she was a minor, young child. And she screamed so loud that the sound of the glass in the room resonated, and now the sound of glass, or like any sort of tactile, like any sound that comes from like touching glass, like makes her go back to this memory, and it's the color blue for her. So these are two very drastic examples. The first we may not categorize as a traumatic experience, like being yelled at a lake for indecent exposure. Maybe that may not seem traumatic to some of us, but then the second one clearly seems traumatic, and this is just kind of really interesting to consider when discussing trauma in this broad range that it represents. And so it's just very interesting to consider like how subjective not only trauma is, but like the synesthetic associations that may arise out of it. And sorry, I should also add this. So Pfister was particularly interested in infantile sexuality, and the two of them were heavily influenced by Freud. So a lot of this sexual energy and trauma can be like distilled back to Freud's perspectives on the sex and death drives that he talked a lot about in his own work. And so this is where these two authors specifically are drawing their background from, is kind of this perspective of us all having sex drives and us all having death drives, and the two clashing and us constantly acting them out, not only in our like psyche, but also in our adult relationships. So this is the perspective that they're coming from. So then this raises the question of what happens when synesthesia is acquired. And as all of us know, synesthesia can happen from a traumatic brain injury, from an insult to the brain such as a concussion or a stroke or something similar. And there are two hypotheses on how this sort of thing would happen. And the first says that synesthesia is able to happen in a person who did not previously have it before a brain injury or a physical traumatic experience, because there's this influx of glutamate and serotonin that come into the brain and stay there, and this sort of cell death happens over that period of time, and that allows for different connections. And then there's this second hypothesis that says there's an interruption in processing between the higher and lower level areas of the brain that are mediated by the serotonin influx, eventually changes the brain chemistry. So to make these more concrete, we have a couple of quotes from the synesthesia list that Dr. Day runs. And as mentioned, some of these quotes may be a little bit sensitive for some people, so please just be in mind with that as we go forward and explore these really subjective but yet meaningful experiences. So this first quote comes from Dr. Day himself, and it is an example of how temporary loss because of a traumatic experience can happen in a person who is a synesthete. He goes on to say, this earthquake, and this is, to give a little context to this, he experienced a very serious earthquake in 1999, where there were a lot of people who died, lost homes, contracted diseases, and a lot of missing people. And as you can imagine, this is a very traumatic experience for him. So he goes on to say, this earthquake and the subsequent epidemics of cholera and hepatitis left me with post-traumatic stress disorder. For about 4 months, I was completely without any of my synesthesias. I was immediately aware of the loss, but was really unconcerned. I was simply too stressed out and had too many other things on my mind to care about my synesthesia being gone. So this kind of shows that, and eventually, this quote was a shortened version of what he gave me, but eventually he was able to regain his synesthesia back slowly but surely. But this kind of just shows that the trauma sort of forced the synesthesia to kind of take a break until it was processed, and then it slowly started coming back. Another example is a change in the synesthetic experience due to grief. So this subject says, the colors became unnaturally dim, then flickered off depending on what was used. First, they became dimmer each day for about 4 days. Then I wrote the synesthesia list. Next thing I know, they're nearly gone. But today, only like a month or two afterwards, my colors are back and they seem brighter than ever. And then she goes on to explain that this happened due to a loss of a cousin. And so that's interesting for us as well to think about how grief is also trauma and how it can have the impact on a synesthetic experience. This would be something we'd categorize as an emotional trauma. And the first one from Dr. Day was sort of a blend of both physical and an emotional trauma, but they both kind of seem to react in similar ways. The next example is a suppression of the synesthetic experience due to trauma, and this is kind of a long quote, so I don't think I'll go through the whole thing, but this comes from a man who had a tumor removed, and he goes on to say, I had brain surgery 18 months ago. I had to remove a tumor, and was not much aware of my synesthetic experience in the 2 months of recovery. Synesthetic experiences have been less noticeable as I continue to regain my strength. And then eventually he goes on to say that he still has not regained it yet, and that he hopes that once he's completely recovered from the brain injury trauma or the removal of the tumor, that he hopes once the healing process is done that his synesthesia will come back. But as of now, it doesn't look like it is there, and if it is, he has to really concentrate on it. So this next is from another blend of both an emotional and physical trauma. The subject goes on to say, I was raped when I was 7. Before that, my synesthesia was everywhere. Then it seemed like as I repressed those memories, I also repressed some of my synesthesia. I still had music color, but that was it. And then she kind of goes a little bit more into detail of how before she was 7, she had color taste and grapheme color synesthesia. And now that she hasn't repressed the memories of the traumatic experience of experiencing a rape, she is able to remember her colors. This next example is really interesting to us because it also involves the therapeutic process in healing trauma. So this subject says, I only found a name for my way of experiencing the world while undergoing my therapy. I can see that both the trauma and the EMDR I underwent it nearly a year ago and had an impact on my synesthesia. The former added a layer as if it were the latter intensified it. The trauma added color. Before my trauma, I experienced colors as clouds around people or events, and most experiences were spatial with colorless geometric shapes or sequences in which, though present, color played a relatively insignificant role. My trauma increased the amount of color in what I now call my flashcards, and the EDMR, on the other hand, intensified the experience and added a physical sensation to the flashcards. So in parentheses here, I didn't read that, but the flashcards are these shapes that come into his or her visual field, and they sort of remind her of the attack and the experience of that trauma. And this person goes on to say, the first 3 sessions of the therapeutic intervention were nearly unbearable because of how intense the synesthesia was during them. So this is very interesting also, that not only is the trauma playing a role in how the synesthetic experience has changed, but also the therapeutic experience as well. So we didn't get any quotes from people who acquired synesthesia after the fact, but this is well documented, and we can talk about this off the record if we want to later. But just to quickly breeze through, there are a couple of cases of acquired visual auditory synesthesia. There is a case of temporal lobe seizures resulting in audition and vision of graphemes, and then auditory tactile synesthesia in a stroke patient up to 6 years, and then post-surgical blindfolding inducing synesthesia after eye surgery. So concluding remarks, it's important to differentiate what we are saying versus what we're not saying. And we are not saying that that synesthesia is solely caused by trauma. We're just simply saying that it can play a role in how it is experienced in a person, or it can actually activate it in a person. Physical and emotional trauma are often part of the same experience. This is something that we've learned in this process. Synesthesia can be affected by the trauma. Trauma activates plasticity not only in the brain but the body, so the body does have a memory outside of the brain, and there is a well-documented information on how the body, after it wakes up out of a trauma, has to actually reacquaint itself with the environment as if it were a completely novel, brand new environment, because it physically changes from that experience. Lastly, what causes synesthesia is acquired synesthesia is still hypothetical. And if you know anybody who is having a difficult time with their trauma and synesthesia, I would say these are 2 great starting points, these 2 books, The Body Keeps the Score and Neurosculpting, which focuses on self-directed neuroplasticity, so creating new behaviors to replace maladaptive ones that don't allow the body to heal from the trauma. So thank you. Lastly, I want to thank Dr. Day and my advisor in my MFT program, Dr. Nancy Dietrich, who's a specialist on trauma, and Dr. Day, who is his awesome self.
We do have a couple minutes for questions. So, question?
That was great, thank you. One thought I had was, as you develop kind of like more qualitative work, it'd be interesting to kind of see what domains within trauma that people tend to report. So as an example, did you get a sense whether people after trauma ruminated a lot more about their trauma and whether that specifically tied to a change in their synesthetic experience.
Yeah, no, we didn't have access to that, but that's a really important point to consider as well, yeah.
When you say acquired synesthesia
Mhm.
versus, what's the difference between that and learned? Because I know in the UK, there's a Dr. Daniel Bohr who's doing a lot of research on acquired synesthesia, and he's doing similar research.
Yeah, learned wasn't something we actually looked at in this. It was more congenital versus acquired. Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you. Oops, okay, yeah.
I saw a term that you used called tactile synesthesia, and I didn't understand what that meant.
Yeah, and so, and these are, I don't know if Dr. Day wants to answer that because this comes from his list, yeah.
But say, tactile synesthesia would be two different ways you can throw this, but one way to throw it would be that the synesthetic perception is touch. You, like for instance, you hear music